I'm Rick Seraphinoff. I teach horn at Indiana University, and I'm also a maker of natural horns of various types from different periods. And we're taking a little break from the International Trumpet Making Workshop this week, where we make these kind of trumpets, to talk for a few minutes about historical horns. And I've assembled some of the horns that I make to give you a little idea of the development of the horn. From the very simple hunting horn of the 17th century all the way to the valve horn. This one almost makes it to the modern horn. So the natural horn works like the natural trumpet in that it plays an overtone series. And it goes something like this. And for those who understand tonality, there were some notes in there that weren't very well in tune. But back during this time, that was considered just the way that horns and trumpets sounded. So you might hear and everyone just accepted that as horn intonation. As the horn became more of a musical instrument and was used in musical settings, other musicians certainly got a little bit annoyed with that, and so they had to figure out something. This is a horn of the early 18th century, and this is an instrument that would have been used actually to play in an orchestra or in a chamber music group. The horn was still held with the bell up in the air. Only nowadays, listeners and conductors and recording engineers and CD buying public and audiences really like to hear things in tune. We've had to make a small compromise to put a hole in the horn, which wasn't done back in the day. So I can now play a scale of and everybody's happy. As the horn developed, players discovered that they could actually alter the sound of the instrument. That was a Baroque horn as it was played in a Baroque orchestra with a very brilliant sound, because when horns and trumpets played in orchestras in the Baroque period, they were very soloistic. In other words, if the brass were playing something, they were probably playing the melody. But later on, in the classical period, horns sort of went into the texture, as did trumpets, and became more supporting instruments. This is an early classical horn from about 1760. The original was actually dated 1760, made in Vienna. And players began putting their hand in the bell, with which method they could actually alter the pitch and get a few extra notes. So I corrected the bad note, but they also discovered they could do something else. By moving the hand in the bell, you could fill in all the gaps in the overtone series. That was a complete chromatic scale, and this led to a lot of solo music, because composers like Haydn and Mozart saw the possibilities of being able to play a brass instrument that was completely chromatic. And it just happens that in Western music, the overtones correspond to the consonances of the music, and the stop notes to a lot of dissonances. So Mozart knew that the neighbor tones and leading tones would very often fall in the stop notes, which kind of enhanced the music. So Mozart wrote, and you could hear the stop note fell on the non-harmonic tone and sort of a strong appoggiatura. So Mozart used the instrument in the key, for the most part, in which the piece was written. This is crooked in E flat at A430 for those with perfect pitch, and the piece is in E flat, and that all worked out very nicely. Later on, composers discovered that you didn't have to stick to the key of the horn. You could write pieces in other keys and play chromatically so that you didn't always need to use the fundamental of the overtone series. This is a slightly later instrument, an early 19th century French instrument. The original was made by Antoine Hallery in Paris, and this would have been a good instrument for possibly music of the time of Beethoven and composers of that period. What key am I in? F horn. This is Beethoven, actually. And I ended on a stopped F, so I cadenced in the key of B flat on my F horn. Later on, this technique got so sophisticated that in France, music that was written that was completely chromatic with almost no regard to the key of the instrument. This is a copy, a brand new one in fact, of a course solo by Marcel Auguste Raoult, and the original was probably made around 1820. And with this instrument, soloists could play just about any chromatic music. Here's a little piece of an etude by Gallet, who was a French horn soloist and professor at the Paris Conservatory and composer. That's from one of his etudes for low horn, probably written in the 1840s. The horn is in E. The piece is in the written key of E minor. So if you're playing on an E horn, you play an E that must have been in G, A flat minor, G sharp minor, very out of the way key, and almost completely unrelated to the overtone series of this instrument. So when things got really crazy with that technique, and they were pushing things further and further, it was about the time the valve was invented. This is an fairly early valve horn. This is actually an original horn, the only one on the table that I didn't make myself. And it was made by Courtois, and the valves were actually made to be detachable. so that I can put a slide in this horn and play it in the same way that I did the other horns, the hand horn. Or I could put in my valve section and be chromatic. First of all, the valve was used in conjunction with hand stopping in France. And they would do things that would leave those leading tones and neighbor tones as stop notes. In Germany, players took to the valve horn right away, and they just decided this is a great invention, a totally chromatic instrument, and they didn't do any of the hand stopping. But the French really liked their closed notes and the expressive possibilities, the sort of vocal vowel sounds that they could get to emulate singers. But that was a very complicated system, and finally the totally chromatic valve horn really took effect. That was from the opening of the second movement of the Taffenel Woodwind Quintet, famous sort of low horn solo written for the early valve horn. And that's how the horn got to be the way we have it today, the modern French horn with valves, and its entire evolution from the early hunting horn that simply played hunting signals. As instrument makers, first of all, we started making natural horns really 40 or 50 years ago by taking out the valves of a modern single F horn and putting a tube in place so that we could play it as a natural horn. But the problem was it had all the acoustics of a modern horn. Modern horns are made to play in large bands and orchestras and make a lot of sound, and they're a little bit brighter sounding, and they respond very quickly. That's a rather big sound. After looking at actual old horns, we started to discover that the sound was different, the response was different, and the way it fit into an orchestra was different. You can hear the sort of softer, gentler attack. You can hear the smaller, more compact sound. So when I'm playing in an orchestra of 15 to 20 people in a Haydn symphony, this would be a much more appropriate sound. So that was our task as instrument makers, to find the right acoustics and reproduce that. And what was necessary to really reproduce an instrument was to, first of all, get the dimensions, and then have tooling made that would do that instrument, to have a bell mandrel that would make this shape, and then to find out a little bit about the techniques of producing the instrument. And if this instrument were not so highly polished, this is a brand new horn, you would be able to see the seams that go along the bell longitudinally. That is the old construction method of the horn, where the bell is produced by hand, basically. So to copy this horn, I had to go through a whole process of measuring and making drawings. And the most difficult part to copy on a French horn is the bell flare. And there are a couple of methods. When you get up into the sections where the tubing is tapering, you simply measure where you are with a caliper and measure in a couple of directions, because almost no tube on an old instrument is round, and you have to average things out. And then make drawings. And I end up with a drawing that I will send to a machine shop to make the tooling for the horn. The most difficult part actually is getting the flare of the bell and making the form of this section of the bell, because I can't really put my calipers in any given place and get an accurate measurement. So we have to use all sorts of different methods. My favorite method is to cut a piece of cardboard and keep trimming it very slowly and carefully until it fits into the bell perfectly with no gaps. And then I have the shape of the inside of the bell, and I can make my drawings to send to the machinist, because we're not copying the outside shape, we're copying the inside shape, and that's more complicated. And then you have to go inside the instrument with steel measuring balls, and just use any way you can to get the dimensions, and then measure the metal thickness, because old instruments are generally thinner than modern instruments, and then try to get a feel for the hardness of the metal. Brass, which is the most common metal for French horns, can be left in its very soft state, or it can also be work hardened to a harder state, and that has a great effect on the sound. When we're reproducing old instruments, we try to be as authentic as possible, and we try to make the sound that they made back in whatever period we're dealing with. There are some difficulties with that, though. For instance, the Baroque horn was a single pitch, fixed pitch horn from the earliest times up until the middle of the 18th century. You had a horn in a single key, and that was the only key you could play in. So if you were playing in the Handel water music, you would have your D horn and your F horn. They would be different sizes. That means you would travel with one over each shoulder and try to protect your instruments until you got to the gig. Well, today we travel on airplanes, and it's a little inconvenient to travel with a G horn and an F horn and an E flat horn and a D horn. So one compromise that we have made is that we very often wrap the instrument a little bit differently and hope that we can keep the acoustics intact. So this is a horn copied from Johann Wilhelm Haas early in the 18th century in Nuremberg. The original was made, and it didn't look like this. Its bell looked like this, but it was wrapped in two large coils, and it was an F horn. So what I've done for the convenience of players, and what most of us do with these horns, is that we make it with a crook. The acoustics are very close, not precisely that of the original horn, because you necessarily have to have a little bit of cylindrical tubing when you're doing different crooks. And so now I can have my F horn like that, with an F overtone series that sounds like this. And then I can quickly and easily change my horn to D by putting a cylindrical piece in between the crook and the horn. Now I have a D horn. You can hear the difference in sound between the two horns. The D horn is a mellower sound. There's also another compromise that everyone who plays a natural brass instrument necessarily has to do these days, and that is that you heard the overtone series and the discrepancy, the way in which it doesn't match up with equal temperament or other historical temperaments. Which I think people were willing to accept early on. But nowadays we've had to make a bit of a compromise. We put holes in the instrument to give us intonation that is acceptable to modern ears. I think is the best way to put it. And these holes didn't exist in the 18th century. Trumpets and horns didn't actually start experimenting with holes until close to 1800. But this compromise makes it possible, first of all, to play in tune with the other instruments today, and also to have the sound of the bell up in the air. I could play this horn with my hand in the bell in a much more later 18th century or early 19th century way, and totally alter the character of the instrument. This is not what Bach and Handel heard. They heard this brilliant open sound, so we've made that compromise to make that possible. So there are a few compromises that are necessary in this business, though there are trumpet players and horn players who have been experimenting and practicing. You have to start when you're very young and keep doing it for a long time to play the open horn and the open trumpet and lip the notes into tune. And there's some players who are having great success doing that. So we hope that the next generation will carry on with that tradition.